Okay, I'd just like to welcome you all here from the Old Mouton Hall, University of Louisiana, Lafayette. I'm Ray Brasser. I'm the coordinator of the anthropology program in this department. And it just tickles us a great deal to collaborate with the people that are here today and to welcome you all to this event, which is very important for science and for humanity, of course, as well. We have an anthropology society, a student group that's helping to host this event too. Mr. Ramsey Purple is the president of that group, and we're glad he's here with us today. And of course, we have a lot of very important guests and speakers here that we need to learn from. But I just want to say welcome, and if there's something I can do, please let me know. I'll be around here and looking forward to hearing about the program. Of course, the Sierra Club is a major host for this event as well. And we have Mr. Harold Scheffler with us today. I'd like to invite him to say a word.
I just want to say thank you all for being here. I want to especially thank the presenters who are here to educate us about a very important subject to us all. And I want to especially thank Dr. Ray for hosting us and putting this together. Thank you.
All right. Emily? I'm Haywood Martin. I'm vice chair of the Acadian Group, Sierra Club here, and chair of the statewide Sierra Club. And we're happy to be involved in organizing this event. Thanking Ray and thanking Emily for coming together and all the folks that are helping on this presentation to put it together. So Emily Maung-Douglass with Sea Grant was the real person that initiated this. She came to one of our meetings about 8 or 9 months ago and said we'd like to do something. And we came up with a plan to send her a list of things we'd like to see, and one of them was about dispersants. And here we are. This is really great that this came together. So Emily Maung-Douglass with Sea Grant.
Thank you so much. And also thank you to the Sierra Club and to everyone at ULL, the Anthropology Society. It's really great that we could have this seminar at this venue. So I'm Emily Maung-Douglass. I'm from Louisiana Sea Grant, and I'm also representing the Gulf of Mexico Sea Grant.
We're working on it. Thank you.
All right, so we're working out some technical issues maybe. But so I'm with the Louisiana Sea Grant and the Gulf of Mexico Sea Grant Oil Spill Outreach Program. And I'd like to let you know first that we'll be having the seminar itself. I'll be talking a little bit about our oil spill outreach program, some neat resources that you all might be able to go home and use this evening even, and maybe set up a little bit of framework for what our guest speakers will be talking about. Drs. Andrew Nyman and Chris Green from LSU Ag Center. And lastly, after that, we're going to have a question and answer session. We're going to save the questions for last. And then just after that, I hope that you'll all stick around and fill out your input and evaluation forms. They're in these folders that are out front, and also pens are available as well. And so inside there, you've got a one-pager about our program, 2 brochures that Drs. Green and Nyman and their grad student, Bran Wagner, have come up with to help people understand oil and toxicity. And then this pocket here has the input and evaluation form. And we're really using that input and evaluation form to understand what things you really care about and what questions we've answered for you and what questions you still have, so that we can create more seminars like this that are better targeted to your needs and bulletins that suit your interests. So to get into it, what, this? All right. Okay. All right, we'll figure this out. We'll figure it out together. Okay, so as I mentioned, I'm with the Sea Grant program, the Gulf of Mexico Oil Spill Outreach, and we've been sponsored by GOMRI, the Gulf of Mexico Research Initiative. So just to get an idea of who I'm talking with, how many of you are already familiar with Louisiana Sea Grant or one of the Sea Grant programs? Okay, so a good number of you. Robert Twilley, our director, included in the audience here. So Sea Grant, I like to say that if there's a big body of water near you, whether it's a Great Lake or an ocean, or in our case, the Gulf of Mexico, there's probably a Sea Grant program near you. There are 33 programs nationwide, and the idea of Sea Grant is to enhance and conserve the practical use of our natural resources that are coming from either the ocean or the Great Lakes. So we're a non-advocacy organization, so that means we don't tell you what to think one way or another on an issue. We present you with the best available science and say, you're intelligent, you can make up your own mind what you think about it. So you're going to see a little bit of that tonight. We're university-based programs. The one in Louisiana is based at LSU in Baton Rouge. And we receive both federal funding from NOAA and also some money from the states as well. And we have three major areas of emphasis that you can see. We have three major areas of emphasis that you can see here, one of which is extension. And that's what we're doing tonight, extending the science out to people, from the lab out to people within the community who could use it either in decision making or for your livelihood. So there's 4 Sea Grant programs within the Gulf of Mexico, one in Texas, one in Louisiana that I've already mentioned. Mississippi and Alabama share a Sea Grant program, and then there's also one in Florida. So as I mentioned before, we are sponsored, the Oil Spill Outreach Program is sponsored by the Gulf of Mexico Research Initiative, or GOMRI. And what GOMRI is a $500 million 10-year investment by BP from non-penalty funds. So it's completely separate from the Restore Act. And it's managed by a 20-member independent research board, and also the Gulf of Mexico Alliance, or GOMA. And the goal of GOMRI is to really help people understand the consequences of Deepwater Horizon and come up with better ways to mitigate those consequences and better respond to them as well. So GOMRI has funded over $170 million worth of projects so far. And if you just look across the map in terms of research that's been funded, you can see these red little plus signs on the map are scientists who are leads on research projects surrounding Deepwater Horizon, and the blue dots are co-leads on projects. And there's also a few scientists working internationally as well. So many people all studying this disaster that happened. And GOMRI is really focused on 5 major areas of interest, and those sort of span really a broad range. These are some examples of topics that people have studied using GOMRI funds. And really what it breaks down into is 5 basic areas, and those are physical fate and transport of the oil and dispersants, the biological and chemical behavior and degradation of oil and dispersant mixtures, environmental effects, technological advances, and then finally public health. So these projects fall into those different categories. So a neat resource that you can go home and try tonight that I think all of you would probably be very interested in is GridC, the data cooperative that GOMRI has, and it's available on their website. Anyone who is funded with GOMRI money, part of the stipulation of receiving that funding is that they have to load their data onto this database. So it's available for anyone. You don't have to have a special username and password or anything like that. It's open to anyone, so it's very transparent. Another great resource that you may not be aware of is their publication database. And this is the same sort of setup as well. anyone who's received GOMA funding and has had a project published, that publication, the abstract, and a link to it are listed on this webpage as well. So also available through the GOMA website. So once you have research, you don't want it to just sit in the lab in someone's notebook collecting dust, right? You want to get it out into the community, into the hands of people who could use the information, right? So GOMA has also supported a lot of outreach activities. And so those have included things like their research consortia who are out there doing projects also have their own outreach programs. They've funded things like the Consortium for Ocean Leadership. You might be familiar with them because they do the National Ocean Sciences Bowl. GOMA has also funded things like the Smithsonian Ocean Portal, which is this really cool infographic. It's available online and it has these diagrams of the oil spill. And you can click on specific points within the diagram and it explains what was happening scientifically in a really cool and easy to understand kind of way. They've also funded programs like our Sea Grant Oil Spill Outreach Program, which I'm going to explain a little bit about. So, as I mentioned before, there are 4 Sea Grant programs across the Gulf of Mexico, and we've all banded together in this effort to help share oil spill science. So, I have 3 counterparts, one of whom is here tonight. So starting out in Texas, we've got Christine Hale, and she covers environmental health effects regarding the spill. I'm in Louisiana Sea Grant, and I tend to look more at the chemical and toxicological effects of the spill. Larissa Graham, who's here tonight, she does public health, and she wears 2 hats. She's housed in the state of Alabama and also covers the state of Mississippi. And then we have Monica Wilson in Florida, who looks at things like the physical transport of the oil and dispersants. And then we have a coordinator, Steve Sempier, who's at Mississippi, Alabama Sea Grant. So, as I mentioned before, there are other outreach efforts regarding the oil spill. Ours wasn't looking to compete with them, but really to complement the work that they're doing. So instead of maybe targeting a very general, broad audience or K through 12, what we're looking to do is to work with these target audiences listed here. These are audiences that Sea Grant has traditionally worked with, so we have like really strong ties in the community. And these are groups that we felt either, their livelihoods depend on the Gulf of Mexico, or they could really use this information in decision making. So we did a needs assessment, the 4 specialists, and we've spoken to date with maybe about 500 stakeholders from across the Gulf of Mexico and tried to understand what kinds of oil spill science questions they have. What were the things that they wish that they had known when the spill happened 5 years ago? What would have made their lives easier or better in terms of decision making or dealing with the spill itself? So from that, we've come up with a series of deliverables. So 12 bulletins, 12 science seminars and workshops. These are just some examples of some topics that we've come up with based on those needs assessments, those questions, and including the seminar this evening. So that brings us to the seminar, Understanding the Toxicity of Oil and Dispersant Mixtures and the Development of Alternatives. So I feel like based on the questions that we've gotten from people and just, those topics right there, to create a framework, you really have to ask the question, what happens if the shoreline does get oiled? Why do you use dispersant in the first place? So if we look at some of the work that came out of Deepwater Horizon, this is a great example. Everyone in Louisiana knows, and probably many people across the Gulf know as well, that Louisiana has an extremely high rate of land loss, right? So you don't want to do anything that's going to exacerbate that. On the left-hand panel, you can see this is an edge of a marsh, and it's nice and smooth and even, not eroded away in an unnatural looking fashion. And then if you look on this panel on the right here, you can see how it's really been carved away. It's really eroded. Just huge chunks are taken out of it. And that's an area that was heavily oiled during the spill, during the 2010 BP spill. So how does that happen in the first place? So if you look at the upper left-hand panel, panel A, you can see that this is a marsh that's been heavily oiled. There's a lot of oil there. What happens is the oil actually starts to kill off the roots. Okay, and the roots are the roots of the plants in the marsh. And the roots of the plant in the marsh are what's really going to give that marsh that structural integrity. It's going to keep all the sediments, all the muds from running out into the water. So it's holding the marsh together. And if you don't have those roots, then you end up with a situation like this panel here on the right, panel B. And so you can sort of see there's this dark void. That's where there's no sediment. Up at the top, you can see that there's still some plants sort of hanging on. So I'm going to set this speaker down for a second. I'm sorry. So it's going to create this situation. Like imagine this is my forearm is the base of the marsh, and this top part of my hand is the top of the marsh. It's called an overhang. So you can see that the structure, maybe it's not very strong, right? And it's going to keep it getting hit by waves, and eventually it can fall because there's nothing supporting it underneath, right? So that's called an overhang. And what this group found was that overhangs in marshes that were heavily oiled, or there are actually significantly larger overhangs in marshes that were significantly oiled. And overhangs, as you can imagine, eventually lead to situations like C and D, where the marsh gets eroded away at a rapid rate. And that's what GOMA researchers found out, was that areas that are heavily oiled have higher rates of erosion. Remember, this is, Louisiana is an area that has already high rates of erosion. And they also found that the levels of PAHs, or polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, I'm not going to say that word again tonight. I'm just going to call them PAHs. But these chemicals are present in coal and oil and tar. And who in here likes barbecue? Show of hands, barbecue? Really, no more people than that? So if you've enjoyed barbecue recently, you've also enjoyed PAHs. They're those charred bits on the fat of your animal that you're eating. So those have PAHs too, right? So you're exposed to them in your everyday life, but there are certain ones that can be carcinogenic or cause health problems. And that's why, after the spill, there's been a lot of talk about those compounds. And so they actually found in this study that the PAH levels in sediments in those marshes where they were heavily oiled could be as high as 133 parts per million. And you might be saying, well, what's a part per million? A part per million, could everyone in the room just close their eyes for a moment? Play along. Okay, so an Olympic-sized swimming pool in your mind, can you picture it? Okay, so you're picturing an Olympic-sized swimming pool. Now imagine 1.5 gallons, like a jug and a half of milk, except now it's oil, being poured into this Olympic-sized swimming pool. That's 1 ppm. So open your eyes and look at that number. So it's 133 ppm in the areas that were really heavily oiled. Some areas did have low oiling, and that's a much lower number, but so that gives you an idea. Okay, so what does that mean in a historical context? You have these really high numbers of these compounds that I told you. Some of them are harmful, these PAHs. So a good example of an oil spill that happened in the past, Buzzards Bay, Massachusetts in 1969. There was a ship that ended up spilling a lot of oil. And the consequence, a lot of marsh was oiled, dead animals like fish, horseshoe crabs, regular crabs. So that was back in the 60s. These photos were taken at that time. Then, as you can see in this photo on the right, in 2005, it looks like conditions are back to normal. It's a beautiful, healthy, vibrant-looking marsh, right? But what about chemically? What about the animals there? So there's this interesting study that was done back in 2007, and the researchers decided to look at fiddler crabs and how oil that was left behind in the sediments affected their behavior and their escape patterns. And what they found actually was that the way that these animals, these little fiddler crabs that are you know, an important prey item, important to the ecology of a marsh system, that they actually weren't able to burrow as deeply because they were trying to avoid areas that had high levels of oil, high levels of these PAHs, these toxic compounds. So if you look at this graph, you can see that the burrow depth for an unoiled site versus an oiled site is quite different. It's much deeper in unoiled sites. You can also see that the shape of these burrows. So if we look at the left-hand panel photograph, the oiled sites, you can see that the shape of the burrows is a little bit curved. And the researchers actually found that this is where they're trying to avoid oil. They're a little curved. They're also pretty small. They're about half the size to a third of the size of these much longer burrows taken from unoiled areas. And just in case you're wondering how they got these burrows so exact, what they did was they went out into the marsh, they found the fiddler crab burrows, and they poured plaster of Paris into the holes, let them harden, and then they could pull them out and really quantitatively measure what was happening. So I thought that was pretty cool. Also, they found that the PAH levels were around 134 parts per million. So again, remember that Olympic-sized swimming pool, and a jug and a half is 1 part per million. So really high levels still in 2007, and this spill happened in 1969. They also found that the PAHs had a neurotoxic effect on the crabs as well. It affected their escape response. So, you know, if you're a small little crab and you need to get away from a predator, how quickly you can run away is really important, right? So if you look at this graph, they took crabs from an oiled area, and they either fed them bits of marsh that were from an unoiled source or an oiled source. And on this height of the bar indicates how long it took them to run away from a perceived predator. They created a disc that would swing that would startle these fiddler crabs. So they monitored how quickly it would take them to realize, hey, I should run away. And as you can see from the graph, the ones that were fed the oiled sediments took a significantly longer time to react to this potential predator that could eat them. And remember, this happened in the 60s, and you're still seeing the effect today. So another example of how sediments from oiled areas can affect animals. If we take Deepwater Horizon as an example. So killifish, maybe you're familiar with it as a bait fish. Do we have any fishermen in the room tonight? Anyone that likes to go fishing? Yeah, okay, so you know that this is an important bait fish. So economically important. They're also important ecologically. In terms of animals, you can think of them as more of a base of the food chain kind of an animal. So this is a photograph of them as an adult. And this study by GOMA researchers actually looked at their embryos. The little baby Gulf killifish, while they're still in their little eggs, you can see them developing. They've got an eye, they've got, I don't know, maybe a tail. You can see the heartbeat. So what they did was they took sediments after Deepwater Horizon, and they took them from areas that were unoiled in 2011. So 2 sites in 2011, they took sediment, and then they took sediment from Grand Terre, a site in Louisiana that was badly oiled. And they took sediments from that oiled area in 2010 and 2011. And so they looked at what would happen if you took these sediments, you took them back to the lab, you put them into individual containers, and then you put these little fish embryos into each different container, or into separate containers. And you looked at which ones survived, which ones didn't. What type of sediment were they exposed to? Was it from an unoiled area or an oiled area? They looked at hatching, heart rate. So they found that the mortality, or how many of those that died, the percentage, as you can see from looking at this graph, it's pretty similar. There weren't any significant differences there, oiled versus unoiled. But then when they looked at how many actually hatched, that's a big difference. So the ones that were exposed to sediments from Grand Terre from right after the spill in 2010, a significantly lower portion of them hatched than those that were even exposed to sediments from a year after the spill from either Grand Terre or an unoiled source. Then if you look at heart rate, you see something even more interesting, that it not only affected their heart rate, they have a reduced heart rate if exposed to oiled sediments from 2010 right after the spill, but even sediments from that same site a year later were still impacting the heart rate of those fish. So you can imagine the heart is an important body organ, not just for humans, but for fish as well. So that's pretty incredible. So now you have some ideas of, maybe why emergency responders might choose to use dispersants as a response to an oil spill. But what are dispersants, right? Just so we're all on the same page, I'm sure that many of you are already very familiar with them. But let's just go through it again. What are dispersants? So historically, we didn't always use Corexit. The first incidence of dispersant being used was the Torrey Canyon spill off the coast of Cornwall, England, back in the late 60s. And you can see from this map that around here is where the ship went aground, and oil coated this whole southwestern tip of England. The oil traveled down, actually covered some of the shoreline of France as well. And the dispersants that they used were created from kerosene as a solvent and a ship degreaser, something that was used to clean ships' engine rooms. So not necessarily something that's very environmentally friendly, as you can imagine. And the result was that it actually killed off almost all the life in these areas. So you ended up with these areas that were totally devoid of things like razor clams and barnacles and limpets, all these animals that you would typically expect to find on a shoreline. So there was a study that was done in 1968, and they actually looked at how this might affect, because you might think, well, okay, everything dies off. Eventually, it will come back to the same area, right? So 1968, a year after the spill, some researchers took a look to see what the community structure was like, and they found that it was completely different from the way it was before the spill. And so if you look at this upper panel, you can see there's a lot of green algae and brown and red algae. These are sort of the opportunistic species of algae, and lots of laminaria. Everything was really overgrown by all the plants on the rocks. And the reason why these rocks were so overgrown with plant species was because there were no animals to graze the algae. So there was a total shift in the community structure. Then if you look at this bottom panel, in 1977, researchers came back again almost 10 years after the spill, and they found that the herbivores, the animals that eat plants, had returned to the area. There were more, if you can tell from the diagram, more barnacles and limpets and more types of algae, and the laminaria was more under control. It wasn't such an overgrowth of everything, but they found that actually the community structure still wasn't quite the same as it was pre-oil spill. And this is about 10 years afterward. So this is a really nasty case of dispersant use, and it was the first case of dispersant use. So obviously things have shifted since then. One of our dispersants that we use is Corexit, and as you can imagine, we use it to prevent the oiling of shorelines and animals. It is composed of a solvent and a surfactant, and some of the components in Corexit are things that you might find even in your food or your personal care products. There's a portion that's oil-loving and a portion, water-loving, and a portion that's oil-loving. You can see it kind of almost looks like a lollipop or a push pin. And just so you know, the water-loving portion really doesn't want to be in oil, and the oil-loving portion really doesn't want to be in water. And the way that it works is that, say that you have an oil slick, it's going to help break up the oil into little droplets, right? Which wave action can do that too, right? But with wave action, eventually those oil droplets are going to get back together and recreate a slick. So you want to create a situation where that slick doesn't have a chance to reform. And so that's where the surfactants come in, and they sort of stick in those oil droplets, almost like push pins in a pin cushion, right? And so once they envelope those individual oil droplets, it's intended that they won't reform the slick, and that's going to enhance bacterial degradation. The bacteria are going to be able to eat these little droplets of oil easier than they would a gigantic slick. So that sort of gives you a background for what our two speakers, Drs. Chris Green and Andrew Nyman, are going to talk about. They're going to go into the effects of oil and dispersant mixtures, a really specific study that they've done together that sort of looks at how environmental conditions can affect the toxicity of oil dispersant mixtures. And also, Dr. Nyman will talk about some alternatives and really put everything in an even broader framework. So yeah, I'd like to welcome Dr. Christopher Green.